But on the same deck, inside a sturdy cage, a majestic furred Siberian tiger felt the tremor of betrayal. It was the elderly woman, the only kind soul who, in secret, offered him pieces of meat and a look of affection. The scent of cruelty and abandonment ignited a primal fury in his amber eyes. With a roar that made the steel tremble, he tore through the cage bars, leaping with surprising agility into the icy waters. He was not a hunter seeking prey, but a guardian on a mission. Swimming with strength and determination, the tiger reached the grandmother, positioning himself between her and the darkness of the abyss, a living shield against the cruel fate her grandson had planned. The tiger's roar, echoing over the infinite waters, was a thunder that tore through the night's silence and the veil of disbelief. On the deck of the Poseidon's Kiss, the grandson Ricardo stumbled backward, his eyes wide with horror and fury. His plan, so meticulously orchestrated, so cruelly executed, crumbled before his eyes, not due to human error, but by the intervention of a beast he deemed domesticated, a mere accessory to his luxury. The shock was palpable. Rage boiled. The animal he kept captive, the same one he ignored except to display his power, now became the unlikely guardian of his victim. Down below, in the icy depths, Grandmother Sophia felt the impact of the water, the cutting cold that stole her breath. Despair tightened its grip, the salt burned her eyes, but then a massive, warm presence enveloped her. It was the tiger. His muscular body, wet and heavy fur, floated beside her, a beacon of life in the aquatic darkness. She was bound, helpless, but the tiger's head, with his amber eyes now fixed on the yacht and then on the depths around them, conveyed a silent promise of protection. It was a miracle, a betrayal of logic, but a miracle that embraced her with the brute force of nature. Ricardo, recovering from the initial shock, ran to the railing, his face contorted into a mask of hatred. "No, it can't be, you filthy animal! Get back here!" he shouted, his voice diluted by the wind and waves. He could not believe that his grandmother, the woman he had just condemned to death, was being protected by his own tiger. The humiliation was unbearable. His henchmen, who watched the scene from afar, paralyzed by fear and surprise, dared not move a muscle. Ricardo's authority, once unquestionable, now seemed fragile, ridiculous. Meanwhile, in the water, the Siberian tiger, named Boris, did not avert his gaze. He swam in slow circles, keeping Sophia afloat with smooth, powerful movements of his body. His acute senses picked up the ocean's subtle vibrations, the scent of blood, the scent of fear, and now a new, more primal, more menacing scent. Shadows began to form in the depths, slender, swift silhouettes. Dorsal fins, like sharp blades, emerged from the surface, tearing the water with a promise of violence. Sharks. They had sensed the feast. Sophia, despite the paralyzing cold and the terror that enveloped her, felt a strange calm beside Boris. Her eyes met the tiger's, and there, in the middle of the ocean, a deep and unbreakable connection was forged. It was the gratitude of a lifetime, the recognition of a pure soul amidst depravity. She knew she was at the mercy of fate, but she was not alone. The tiger, her tiger, was there. On the yacht, Ricardo bellowed orders, but his men were petrified. "Get the weapons! Shoot that monster! Don't let her escape!" But the fear of the tiger, now free and wild, was greater than the fear of Ricardo. Furthermore, the sight of the sharks, which were beginning to encircle the tiger and the elderly woman, was a terrifying spectacle too great to ignore. The waters around Boris and Sophia began to churn, the predator's agitation intensifying. Boris growled, a guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through the water. He was not a pet. He was a predator in his element, now with a mission. His muscles tensed, ready for battle. He positioned his imposing body to protect Sophia, his eyes fixed on the dark silhouettes that approached. The first shark, a grey giant, lunged, its mouth agape, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. The attack was imminent, death a certainty. But Boris did not retreat. He was the last line of defense, a shield of flesh and fury against the jaws of death, and the ocean prepared to witness a fight that would defy all laws of nature. The first shark, with the ferocity of a living torpedo, tore through the water towards Sophia. But Boris, the Siberian tiger, was not easy prey. With an underwater roar that transformed into a guttural bubbling sound, he spun his massive body with surprising agility for an animal of his size. His claws, once used for hunting in the Siberian snow, now extended into the saltwater, seeking a foothold, an advantage. The shark's lunge was deflected by a powerful blow from the tiger's front paw, which struck the marine predator's flank with the force of a hammer. It was not an attack to kill, but to repel, to gain time. The water exploded in foam and blood, not Boris's, but a dark trail that spread rapidly, attracting even more attention from the predators lurking in the depths. Sophia, bound and helpless, felt the shock of the collision through the tiger's body that protected her. The ocean's cold was torture, but the warmth of the beast beside her, the fury in his amber eyes, was an anchor amidst the chaos. She watched the deadly dance unfold, the dark silhouettes of the sharks circling, their empty eyes reflecting the moonlight. The scent of blood intensified, a metallic wild aroma that promised more violence. Every movement of Boris was calculated, every growl, a declaration of war. He was not just fighting for his life, but for the life of the only person who had shown him kindness. It was a loyalty that transcended the barrier of species, a silent pact forged in secrets and affection. On the deck of the Poseidon's Kiss, Ricardo was in a frenzy. "Shoot, shoot, you useless fools! Kill that animal, kill the sharks! Do something!" he bellowed, his voice hoarse with despair and rage. But his henchmen, men accustomed to controlled violence, were paralyzed. The scene below was primal, too wild. A Siberian tiger, a creature of the land, fighting sharks in the ocean to protect a bound old woman. It was a spectacle that defied reason, that awakened an ancestral fear. The weapons, once firm in their hands, now seemed heavy, useless against the fury of nature. They saw the blood spreading, the dorsal fins cutting the surface, and knew that any shot could hit the old woman or the tiger himself, unleashing an even greater fury. Boris, with a roar that seemed to tear the very water, dived. He could not fight all the sharks simultaneously while keeping Sophia afloat. His strategy was defensive, but also offensive. He used his massive body to push away the predators, biting and scratching whenever one got too close. A second shark, more audacious, tried to flank, coming from below. Boris felt the vibrations spun, and with an agility that belied his size, sank his fangs into the shark's rough skin. The marine animal shrieked, a piercing sound lost in the depths, and thrashed violently, dragging Boris down for a moment. Sophia felt the tug, the current forming around them. Air in her lungs was scarce, the salt burned. But she did not despair. Her eyes were fixed on Boris, on his Herculean struggle. She knew he was exhausted, that every movement was a monumental effort. But he did not give up. He was her last hope, her striped guardian angel. The sight of that animal, whom she had secretly fed, now risking his life for her, was proof that kindness, however small, always found a way back. Up above, Ricardo, seeing his men not reacting, grabbed a high-powered rifle. "You cowards! I'll do it myself!" he snarled, pointing the weapon at the water. But aiming was difficult. The target moved constantly, and the darkness of the night, coupled with the yacht's sway, made the shot almost impossible. He didn't just want to kill the tiger. He wanted Sophia to witness the death of her protector before being devoured. The cruelty in his heart was infinite. He fired a wild shot, which ricocheted off the water far from the target, only adding more noise and fury to the scene. Boris emerged, panting, with a superficial tear on his paw, but his eyes still burned with determination. He had managed to ward off the two most aggressive sharks, but others approached, attracted by the scent of blood and the commotion. The circle of dorsal fins narrowed. The pressure increased. The tiger knew he could not fight forever. He needed a strategy, a way out. His eyes swept the horizon, searching for anything, any salvation. The yacht was too far to reach with Sophia bound. Land was a mirage. Suddenly, his eyes focused on something. Not far away, a dark patch floated on the water. It was a piece of wreckage, perhaps a tree trunk or a piece of wood from an old shipwreck. Small, but perhaps enough to serve as support. A wild and desperate idea began to form in the tiger's mind. He needed to get Sophia out of the water, if only for a brief moment, so she could breathe and he could gain a tactical advantage. With renewed effort, Boris began to swim, no longer in defensive circles, but in a straight line, pushing Sophia ahead of him towards that floating piece of hope, while the sharks, like ravenous shadows, tightened their encirclement, ready for the final attack. The battle was far from over, and the ocean, silent witness, awaited the outcome of that impossible fight. The ocean, vast and indifferent, observed the struggle for survival. Boris, the Siberian tiger, transformed into a leviathan of stripes and fury, pushed Sophia ahead of him. Every stroke, every movement of his massive body was an act of pure will. The tear on his paw ached, but the physical pain was insignificant compared to the urgency of his mission. His amber eyes, now beacons of determination in the aquatic darkness, were fixed on the dark patch that promised a brief refuge. The sharks, however, were not easily deterred. The scent of blood, the frenzy of the hunt propelled them. They moved like ravenous ghosts, their slender silhouettes cutting through the water, growing bolder with each passing moment. One of them, an impressively sized bull shark, lunged again, coming from below, aiming for Sophia's bound legs. Boris, with a growl that became an underwater bubble of fury, spun with surprising speed. His front paw, armed with sharp claws, struck the predator's snout with brutal force. The shark recoiled momentarily, stunned, but the water around them became a canvas of agitation and threat. Sophia, on the verge of unconsciousness, felt the paralyzing cold and overwhelming exhaustion. The salt burned her eyes, water entered her lungs with every cough. But Boris's warmth, the unwavering determination radiating from him, was her only anchor. She felt every impact, every shark lunge, as if they were on her own body, but the tiger's presence was an impenetrable shield. She could barely keep her head above the surface, but her eyes, blurred by water and fatigue, sought Boris's, finding in them a silent promise that he would not give up. On the deck of the Poseidon's Kiss, chaos was the only constant. Ricardo, with the high-powered rifle in hand, fired randomly into the water, more out of frustration than strategy. "You useless fools! Why aren't you doing anything? Kill them! Kill them all!" he bellowed, his voice hoarse with hatred and despair. But his henchmen, men of muscle and little courage in the face of the inexplicable, were petrified. The sight of the tiger, a creature of the land, fighting the predators of the ocean to protect the old woman he himself had thrown to her death, was a spectacle that defied logic and sanity. The fear of the supernatural, of the inexplicable, was stronger than any threat from Ricardo. They saw the dorsal fins, the blood in the water, and the tiger's primal fury, and knew they were witnessing something they should never have seen. Boris, ignoring Ricardo's erratic shots and hysterical shouts, focused on his objective. The piece of wreckage was a few meters away. It was a tree trunk, perhaps from an old shipwreck, floating low in the water, but offering a solid surface. With one last monumental effort, he pushed Sophia towards it. The currents, the agitation of the sharks, everything conspired against them. But Boris's strength was indomitable. He used his snout to push Sophia's head up, while his hind paws beat the water with the force of oars. They reached the trunk. Boris, panting, his muscles trembling with exhaustion, used his claws to grip the rough wood. With a careful movement, he managed to lift Sophia's bound body, pushing her onto the trunk. She fell sideways, coughing, expelling salt water, but her lungs could finally inhale the cold night air without the imminent threat of drowning. She was out of the water, at least partially, her exhausted body resting on the wet wood. Boris then tried to climb up as well. It was not easy. His heavy, wet body slipped on the smooth, curved surface of the trunk. But he persisted, digging in his claws, propelling himself with his hind paws until he managed to balance, lying beside Sophia, his body serving as a protective barrier against the ocean and the sharks. He was exhausted, every breath an effort, but his eyes still swept the water, vigilant. The sharks, frustrated, continued to circle. They bumped the trunk, their fins scraping the wood, their mouths opening and closing in test attacks. The scent of blood was still in the air, and the promise of an easy meal had been postponed, but not forgotten. The trunk swayed precariously, and with each lunge, Sophia felt the icy fear of being thrown back into the open jaws. Ricardo, seeing them on the trunk, let out a cry of fury. "No, don't dare escape, I'll end this!" he bellowed, reloading the rifle. He aimed more carefully, his rage sharpening his senses. This time he would not miss. He wanted to see the tiger dead and the old woman devoured, so that his authority would be restored and his cruelty, finally, consummated. But the ocean, which had witnessed the miracle of loyalty, still had its own plans. As Ricardo aimed, an unexpected wave, larger and stronger than the previous ones, hit the yacht. The Poseidon's kiss swayed violently, throwing Ricardo aside. The shot fired, but it went into the night sky, a shooting star of fury and failure. At the same instant, the wave hit the trunk, making it spin and sway even more. Boris and Sophia clung on with all their might, their exhausted bodies fighting against the sea's fury. When the wave passed, the scene had changed. Ricardo's yacht was now a little further away, and the trunk with the tiger and the old woman had been pushed in a new direction. But what most caught Boris's attention, and what made Sophia, despite her exhaustion, open her eyes and look, was a faint light on the horizon, a flickering light, almost imperceptible but unmistakable, a light of land, a light of hope. The battle was far from over, but perhaps, just perhaps, the ocean was offering a chance. The light, a pale, flickering spot in the dark immensity of the ocean. For Sophia, it was more than a light. It was a promise, a whisper of hope that refused to be extinguished. Her eyes, once blurred with despair and salt, now fixed on it with renewed intensity. She coughed again, expelling more salt water, but this time there was a purpose in her gasping breath. She was no longer just surviving, she was fighting to reach that light. Boris, the tiger, felt the change. His exhausted body, trembling from cold and effort, seemed to find a new reserve of energy. His amber eyes, which had swept the horizon in search of anything, now had a target. That point of light was land, salvation, and he would move heaven and earth to get her there. He adjusted his position on the trunk, his massive body forming a shield for Sophia, while his front paws, claws dug into the wood, served as anchors against the sea's fury. The sharks, however, had not given up their prey. The scent of blood still lingered in the water, an irresistible invitation to carnage. They continued to circle the trunk, their dorsal fins cutting the surface like sharp blades. From time to time, one of them lunged, bumping its body against the wood, making the trunk sway violently. Sophia squeezed her eyes shut, her heart pounding, feeling the impact through the wood. Each bump was a reminder of the death that stalked them, a constant threat that prevented any moment of peace. Boris growled, a guttural sound, lost in the noise of the waves, but a clear warning to the marine predators. He would not let them pass. Up above, on the deck of the Poseidon's Kiss, Ricardo was in a frenzy of rage. The wave that had thrown him aside and made him miss his shot had only fueled his fury. He stood up, staggering, and grabbed the rifle again. "Start the engines, get closer. I won't let them escape," he bellowed at his henchmen, who were still paralyzed by fear and disbelief. The sight of the tiger and the old woman on the trunk floating towards the light was a personal insult, an affront to his authority and his cruelty. He wanted to see them dead, dismembered, so that the image of that defiant tiger would be erased from his mind. The yacht's engines roared, and the Poseidon's Kiss began to move again, cutting through the waves towards the trunk. Ricardo activated the yacht's powerful searchlights, and beams of white light tore through the darkness, sweeping the ocean until they found the small piece of wood where Boris and Sophia clung. The light blinded them for a moment, revealing the precariousness of their situation, but also the proximity of the danger coming from the yacht. The trunk, propelled by the currents and waves, slowly advanced towards the distant light. Sophia felt the cold penetrate her bones, the overwhelming exhaustion that threatened to drag her into unconsciousness. But Boris's presence, the warmth of his body, the determination in his eyes, was a beacon stronger than any searchlight. She knew he was fighting for her, and that certainty was the only thing that kept her awake, the only thing that prevented her from succumbing. Boris, his body tense, watched the yacht approach. He felt the tremor of the engine in the water, saw the beams of light dancing over them. Danger came not only from below, but also from above. He knew Ricardo would not give up. The tiger, who had spent his life in captivity, now found himself in a battle for survival, not only his own, but that of his protector. He was a predator, but now he was the prey, and the only thing that moved him was loyalty. The light on the horizon seemed to grow, revealing the outlines of a small island, perhaps a fishing village. Hope, once a mere glimpse, now became a tangible goal. But the path there was treacherous. The waves closer to the shore became more irregular, hitting the trunk with greater force. The sharks, still in their frenzy, seemed to sense the proximity of land, intensifying their attacks, as if they knew their time was running out. Ricardo, with the yacht now at a considerable but still threatening distance, raised the rifle again. The searchlights fixed on the target, eliminating the darkness that had previously hampered him. "Nowhere to run!" he shouted, his voice distorted by the wind and hatred. He aimed with precision, no longer at the sharks but directly at the tiger, wanting to extinguish the life of that animal that dared to defy him. A shot echoed in the night. The bullet cut through the air, whistling towards the trunk. Boris, with a primal instinct, spun his body, using it as a shield for Sophia. The bullet hit the wood of the trunk with a dry crack, embedding itself a few centimeters from his paw, sending splinters of wood into the air. The impact made the trunk sway violently, and Sophia let out a muffled cry, almost falling into the water. Boris held her with his snout, pushing her back to the precarious safety of the wood. The yacht approached, and Ricardo reloaded the rifle, his eyes gleaming with sadistic cruelty. He would not stop. The island seemed so close, yet so far. The ocean, which had pushed them towards hope, now seemed to conspire against them, with its treacherous waves and relentless predators. Boris knew time was running out. He needed a plan. A last, desperate move before Ricardo's fury or the shark's jaws sealed their fate. The island, the light, was their only chance, and he would do everything to reach it. Ricardo's hatred was a beacon as intense as the searchlights that tore through the night's darkness. On the deck of the Poseidon's Kiss, he reloaded the rifle with an almost insane fury, each movement charged with murderous intent. "You won't escape! Don't you dare!" he bellowed, his voice distorted by the wind, but laden with a cruelty that crossed the sea. The shots, now more frequent, whistled through the air, embedding themselves in the water around the trunk, raising jets of salty foam. One of them hit the wood again, a few centimeters from Sophia's head, making her cower with a muffled groan. Boris, the tiger, felt every impact, every vibration of the wood. His body, already at the limit of exhaustion, trembled, but his amber eyes did not lose focus. He was a shield, a fortress of flesh and muscle, protecting the fragile old woman. The sharks, in turn, seemed to go mad with the proximity of land and the persistent smell of blood. They bumped the trunk with renewed ferocity, their fins scraping the wood, their mouths opening and closing in test attacks that made Sophia's heart pound. A tiger shark, larger and more aggressive than the others, lunged with brutal force, its massive head hitting the side of the trunk with a dull thud that almost threw them into the water. Boris growled, a guttural sound that rose above the noise of the waves, a clear warning that he would not yield. The island now was more than a light. It was a palpable promise. Sophia could distinguish the silhouettes of the trees, smell the damp earth and vegetation, and even hear the distant sound of waves breaking on the sand. Hope, once a thin thread, now transformed into a feverish, almost unbearable certainty. But the path there was hell. The waves closer to the coast became more treacherous, hitting the trunk with an irregular force, threatening to capsize them at any moment. Ricardo, seeing the island approaching dangerously, realized his time was running out. He could not allow them to reach land. "Accelerate! Cut them off!" he bellowed at his henchman, who reluctantly obeyed. The yacht veered sharply, its engines roaring with terrifying power, creating a gigantic wave in its wake, a wall of water heading directly for the trunk. Ricardo raised the rifle again, not to shoot, but to signal his intention. He would crush them, end the charade once and for all. Boris saw the wave approaching. It was chance or death. He dug his claws into the wood, awaiting the impact. His wild instincts screamed, alerting him to the imminent danger, but also to the opportunity. When the wave hit the trunk, it did not crush it, but propelled it with brutal force. The trunk spun violently, and Sophia let out a muffled cry, almost falling into the water. But Boris was ready. He used the wave's momentum, the force of the water, for something unexpected. With a roar that defied the sea and Ricardo's hatred, he leaped, not into the open water, but onto the crest of the wave, dragging the trunk with him, using his weight and paws to steer it. It was an act of pure strength and instinct, transforming the threat into a desperate means of escape. The trunk, with Boris and Sophia, surfed the giant wave, gaining terrifying speed. The sharks, caught by surprise, were left behind, their lunges useless against the force of nature. The yacht, for a moment, lost sight of them in the wave's foam, while Ricardo screamed in frustration. The island was now a few meters away. Sophia felt the wind on her face, the smell of earth and vegetation invading her lungs. She could see the rocks, the sand, the line of coconut trees swaying in the wind. Hope transformed into a feverish certainty, a warmth that combated the ocean's penetrating cold. The wave carried them to the surf, crashing the trunk hard against the coastal rocks. Boris, even with his exhausted body, did not hesitate. He let go of the trunk at the last instant, falling into the shallow water, but immediately turned to Sophia. The binding still held her to the trunk, which was now tossed back and forth by the final waves, threatening to crush her against the rocks. With a supreme effort, Boris bit the ropes that bound her, using the strength of his jaws to break the wet fibers. He pulled her out of the water, dragging her onto the wet sand, away from the reach of the waves and rocks. They were on the beach, exhausted, soaked, but alive. Sophia coughed, her body trembling with cold and relief. tears mixing with the salt water on her face. Boris fell beside her, panting, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where Ricardo's yacht, now more distant, still loomed like a dark, ominous threat. They had reached land, but the battle was far from over. The island was a refuge, a piece of hope. But Ricardo was still there, and solid ground did not guarantee safety against the fury of a man determined to kill. The night was still young, and the danger still very real. On the damp, cold sand, Sophia coughed, expelling the salt water that had invaded her lungs. Every breath was an effort, every muscle in her body protested against the ordeal. Tears, mixed with the ocean's salt, streamed down her wrinkled face, not just from pain, but from an almost unbearable relief. They were on land, alive. But the land, which promised refuge, was now a new stage for their torment. Beside her, Boris, the Siberian tiger, panted heavily. His massive body trembled, his fur wet and heavy. But his amber eyes, though exhausted, swept the horizon with unwavering vigilance. Ricardo's yacht, the Poseidon's Kiss, hovered in the distance, a dark and menacing blot against the night sky, its searchlight still tearing through the darkness, sweeping the coast like hungry eyes. The scent of earth and vegetation, once a balm of hope, now mingled with the metallic odor of fear and the persistence of sea salt. Sophia tried to stand, but her legs gave way. Boris, sensing her weakness, gently nudged her with his snout, a silent invitation to move, to hide. He knew the open beach was a trap, an easy target under the searchlights that at any moment could fix on them again. On the yacht's deck, Ricardo bellowed, his voice echoing over the water distorted by the wind, but laden with uncontrollable fury. "They won't escape, not here. Prepare the dinghy. I want that animal dead and the old woman. Well, the old woman can drown in the mud of this filthy island." His henchman, previously hesitant, now moved with renewed urgency, the fear of Ricardo overcoming any reluctance. The inflatable dinghy was quickly launched into the sea, and armed men, equipped with flashlights and machetes, jumped in, their dark silhouettes against the yacht's light. Sophia felt the tremor of the earth as the first men disembarked, their heavy footsteps on the sand. The sound of the dinghy's engines, previously indistinct, now approached, and the henchmen's voices, though muffled, were a cruel reminder of the pursuit. Boris growled low, a sound that vibrated in his chest, alerting her. He nudged her again, this time more firmly, towards the dark line of the forest that began a few meters from the beach. With superhuman effort, Sophia dragged herself, using her hands to propel herself, the dry stones and branches scratching her skin. The tiger, with his strength and agility, could have disappeared into the woods in seconds, but he remained by her side, a silent and relentless guardian. He waited for her, guiding her with gentle touches of his snout, his body serving as a barrier against the thorny bushes. The forest was dense, a tangle of tall trees and thick foliage, and the darkness there was almost absolute, punctuated only by the erratic beams of the approaching pursuers' flashlights. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled the air, mixing with a strange, wild aroma that Sophia could not identify. Night sounds, the chirping of insects, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of a bird, enveloped them, creating a symphony of mystery and danger. Boris, with his keen senses, sniffed the air, his ears swiveling to catch every sound. He was a predator in a new environment, but his ancestral instincts guided him. Ricardo's henchmen, now on the beach, began to spread out, their flashlights cutting through the forest's darkness. "Search! They can't have gone far!" One of their voices echoed, and the sound of branches breaking under their feet became audible. The pursuit had begun on solid ground, and Sophia's vulnerability was even greater. Her age and battered body were a burden, but her mind, despite the fatigue, remained lucid. She knew she had to keep up with Boris, that her only chance was to trust him. The tiger led her through the undergrowth, choosing the densest paths where the foliage offered the best cover. He moved with surprising grace, despite his size, and Sophia tried to imitate his movements, crawling and sneaking. Her muscles burned, and the night's cold penetrated her wet clothes, but adrenaline kept her alert. She could feel the warmth of Boris's body beside her, an anchor amidst the chaos. Suddenly, a shout. "There! I saw something!" One of the henchmen had ventured deeper into the forest, and the light from his flashlight swept the darkness, almost revealing them. Boris froze, his body tense, muscles ready for action. He pushed Sophia behind a fallen log, and the two hid, the old woman's heart pounding wildly in her chest. The henchman passed a few meters away, his flashlight dancing dangerously close. The smell of sweat and fear was strong in the air. When the immediate danger passed, Boris pulled her again, this time onto a narrow, almost invisible trail that seemed to snake into the island's interior. The terrain began to rise, and Sophia felt the difficulty with every step. The hope of a village, of human help, seemed increasingly distant, replaced by the harsh reality of a desperate escape in unknown territory. The island was a labyrinth of shadows and sounds, and Ricardo, on the yacht, watched the scene with sadistic satisfaction. He knew the forest was a treacherous place, full of dangers. "Let nature do the dirty work," he murmured to himself, a cruel smile on his lips. "But if nature fails, my men will be there to finish it." He had underestimated Boris once, but he would not make the same mistake again. The hunt had become personal, a matter of honor and revenge. The night was still long, and the island, a battlefield where the lives of an old woman and a tiger depended on every step, every shadow, every heartbeat. The forest, once a promise of refuge, revealed itself as a labyrinth of shadows and dangers. Every step Sophia took was agony, her bare feet wounded by twisted roots and sharp stones hidden beneath the damp foliage. The night's cold, previously biting, now mingled with a sticky sweat of effort and fear. She could feel Boris's warm breath on her neck, the wild scent of his wet body, a mixture of earth, salt, and the indomitable essence of a predator. He was her compass, her shield, her only hope. The beams of light from the henchman's flashlights danced among the trees like hungry eyes seeking prey. The sound of breaking branches and muffled voices approached, and Sophia felt panic tighten her throat. She was no longer the strong woman who had built an empire. She was a fragile old woman, dependent on the brute strength and instinctive intelligence of an animal. Boris, however, moved with surprising agility for his size, his muscles rippling under his striped coat, guiding her through the densest bushes, where the darkness was almost absolute. He seemed to know every turn, every hiding place, as if the forest were an extension of his own being. Suddenly a shout. "I heard something! Over here!" The voice, rough and full of anger, made Sophia freeze. Boris, with a low, guttural growl, pushed her behind a fallen log, covered in moss and ferns. The smell of wet earth and decomposition was intense there, mingling with the metallic odor of fear. One of the men's flashlights swept the spot, the cold white light passing centimeters from their faces. Sophia closed her eyes, her heart beating like a runaway drum. She could hear the henchman's heavy breathing, feel the vibration of the ground as he stepped. Time stopped, stretched to the limit of tension. The man passed, muttering something about old rats and wild beasts, and the light moved away. Boris waited, tense, until the sound of footsteps diminished. Only then did he pull her again, with a gentle nudge of his snout, indicating that the immediate danger had passed, but the pursuit continued. They delved deeper into the island, the terrain becoming steeper and more treacherous. Sophia felt her legs weaken, every muscle protesting. Her lungs burned, and the humidity in the air made breathing difficult. On the deck of the Poseidon's Kiss, Ricardo watched the scene with night vision binoculars. The cruel smile on his lips widened with every movement of his men, every beam of light that swept the darkness. "They're playing hide and seek," he murmured, his voice icy. "But the forest has its own predators, and my men are the most efficient." He ordered the second dinghy to be launched, with more men, more weapons. The hunt was not just for money now, it was a matter of power, of proving that no one, not even a Siberian tiger, could defy his will. Boris continued to guide Sophia, his keen senses picking up every nuance of the environment. He sniffed the air, his amber eyes penetrating the darkness, searching for a path, a refuge. The vegetation began to change, becoming denser and older, with gigantic trees whose trunks were so wide they seemed like walls. The air grew heavier, laden with a sweet, strange scent of night flowers and something older, mineral. They reached a clearing, where the moonlight, filtered by the treetops, revealed an almost mystical scene. In the center, there was an imposing rock formation, with a dark opening at its base. A cave. Boris stopped, his eyes fixed on the entrance, a low growl escaping his throat. It was a place to hide, but also an unknown place, with its own dangers. Sophia, exhausted, fell to her knees on the damp earth. "Boris," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "I can't go on." The tiger turned to her, his eyes expressing a mixture of concern and determination. He gently nudged her towards the cave, insisting. She knew he was right. The beach was an easy target, the open forest a hunting ground. The cave, however frightening, offered a chance to hide, to gain time. With a final effort, she dragged herself to the cave entrance. The air inside was cold and damp, with a strong smell of earth and stone, mixed with an animal odor that made her hesitate. But Boris entered first, sniffing the ground, his senses assessing the environment. He did not seem alarmed. Sophia followed him, fumbling in the dark. The cave was deeper than it looked, and the darkness was absolute, swallowing any trace of external light. They were safe for now from Ricardo's flashlights and men. But what lurked in the depths of that cave? What else did the island hide? Sophia felt a chill that was not just from the cold. The island was a sanctuary, but also a prison, and every step led them deeper into its mysteries, while Ricardo, outside, tightened the noose, determined to turn their escape into a deadly trap. The night was still long, and the danger now took the form of shadows and ancient secrets. The air inside the cave was a cold, damp breath, a brutal contrast to the sticky humidity of the forest. Sophia fumbled in the dark, her hands brushing against cold, uneven rock walls. The smell of earth and stone was overwhelming, but the animal odor that had made her hesitate before now intensified, a wild, indefinable aroma that did not belong to Boris. It was older, denser, imbued in the depths of the earth. Boris, ahead of her, moved cautiously, his soft steps almost inaudible. His amber eyes, adapted to the gloom, were the only points of light in the absolute darkness. Sophia could feel his protective presence, the warmth of his body emanating even in the cave's cold. She trusted him, a trust forged in the abyss of despair and betrayal. But what lurked there, in the island's entrails, was a mystery that even the tiger seemed not to fully comprehend. Every step was a test for her wounded feet and exhausted muscles. She dragged herself, hands forward, fearing what she might find in the next meter. The sound of water droplets falling into invisible puddles echoed, amplified by the oppressive silence of the cave, creating a macabre symphony that made her skin crawl. The cave opened into a larger space, where the darkness was so dense it seemed to have weight. Sophia felt the vastness of the place, the high, invisible ceiling, the walls that disappeared into the shadows. Boris stopped, a low, contained growl escaping his throat. He sniffed the air, his ears swiveling, catching sounds she could not hear. The animal odor grew stronger, almost palpable, mixing with a sweet, putrid smell, like something decaying. Suddenly, a sound. It was not the rustling of leaves or the hoot of a bird. It was a dragging, a soft scraping, coming from the depths of the cave. Sophia froze, her heart pounding wildly. Her eyes tried to pierce the darkness, but it was useless. She was blind, deaf to everything except the sound of that dragging and Boris's heavy breathing beside her. The tiger positioned himself in front of her, his body tense, muscles ready for attack. He was a predator, but there, in that unknown environment, he was also potential prey. That place was not his domain. Meanwhile, outside, Ricardo's hunt intensified. The second dinghy had arrived, spilling more armed men onto the beach. Voices echoed in the forest, closer now, more insistent. "They can't have gone far. The island is small. Search every hole, every crevice." Ricardo, on the yacht, watched the scene with night vision binoculars, a cruel smile on his lips. "The forest is a labyrinth, but every trail has an end," he murmured, the ice in his voice cutting the night silence. "They'll get tired. They'll give up. No one escapes me." He was obsessed, not just with the inheritance, but with the humiliation of having been defied. Inside the cave, Sophia felt a tremor in the ground. It was not an earthquake, but something heavy moving. The dragging became more distinct, accompanied by a guttural sound, a kind of gurgle. Boris growled, a deep, menacing sound that reverberated off the cave walls. He was warning, protecting. Sophia, despite the terror, felt a morbid curiosity. What was it? An animal? A mythical creature of the island? She tried to remember some legend, but her mind was blank, dominated by fear and exhaustion. Boris, with a quick and decisive movement, gently pushed her into a narrow crevice in the cave wall. It was a tight space, barely enough for her to squeeze through. The tiger positioned himself in front of the crevice, his massive body blocking the view of anything that might be approaching. He was a living shield, a wall of muscle and instinct. The sound of dragging approached, and Sophia could feel the vibration in the ground. The putrid smell was almost unbearable now, and she had to cover her nose with her hand. She could hear Boris's heavy breathing, the tremor in his body, the tension in every fiber of his being. He was ready to fight, to die if necessary. Suddenly, an immense shadow moved in the darkness ahead of them. It was not a common animal. It was large, clumsy, and the sound of its movement was heavy, almost like a rock being dragged. Sophia could not see details, only the dark mass moving slowly. Her eyes, accustomed to the darkness, began to discern outlines. Was it something with a shell, perhaps? Or scales? Whatever it was, it seemed to be sniffing the air, moving towards them. The gurgle grew louder, closer. Boris let out a thunderous roar, a sound that echoed through the depths of the cave, a primal challenge that made the mysterious creature stop. There was a tense silence, broken only by their heavy breathing. Outside, the voice of one of the henchmen echoed, muffled but audible. "I found an entrance. It looks like a cave." The light of a flashlight danced at the cave's mouth, a weak beam that did not penetrate the darkness where they were. Sophia was trapped between two dangers, the unknown and monstrous within the cave, and Ricardo's ruthless men outside. The cave, which seemed a refuge, had turned into a trap, a battlefield where the lives of an old woman and a tiger depended on every roar, every shadow, every heartbeat. The night was still long, and the island's ancient secrets were only just beginning to reveal themselves. The air in the narrow crevice was suffocating, the creature's putrid smell mingling with Boris's animal odor, which in turn was a balm of security amidst the terror. Sophia could barely breathe, her heart pounding like a runaway drum against her ribs. She was squeezed in, her knees scraped on the rough rock, her hands covering her mouth to muffle any sound that might escape. Her eyes, now more adapted to the darkness, tried to discern something beyond Boris's massive body, which remained motionless, a statue of muscle and contained fury. The gurgle intensified, a wet, guttural sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. The vibration in the ground grew stronger, indicating that the creature was very close. Sophia felt a shiver run down her spine. She could not see it, but she could feel its monstrous presence, a mass of flesh and scales that exhaled a breath of death and decomposition. Boris let out a low growl, almost a warning, but the creature did not retreat. Instead, the heavy dragging continued, and a sound of wet scraping against the rock indicated that it was moving sideways, perhaps trying to get around the tiger. Suddenly, a beam of light penetrated the cave's darkness. It was not the faint moonlight, but an artificial, intrusive ray that danced at the entrance, revealing for an instant the uneven, damp walls. Ricardo's henchmen's voices echoed, distorted by the reverberation, but unmistakable. "Here! We found the entrance! It's a cave!" The sound of hurried footsteps and the clinking of metallic equipment approached. Sophia felt an overwhelming despair. Trapped between the monster and the men, the cave had become the worst of both worlds. The beam of light deepened, sweeping the darkness, and for a brief moment illuminated the creature. Sophia held her breath. It was gigantic, with a viscous, greenish carapace covered in protuberances and spines. Its small, gleaming eyes reflected the flashlight's light with a terrifying intensity. It looked like a grotesque mixture of crustacean and reptile, with multiple short, thick limbs that dragged across the floor. The putrid smell was almost unbearable now, and Sophia felt her stomach churn. The creature, startled by the sudden light and the men's noise, let out a sharp shriek, a piercing sound that made the air vibrate. It writhed, its limbs scraping violently against the rock. Boris, taking advantage of the distraction, let out a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to tear the very darkness. He advanced a step, his eyes fixed on the creature, his body tense, ready to defend. Ricardo's men, who had just entered the cave, were caught by surprise. "What is that?" one of them shouted, his voice full of panic. The flashlight's light flickered, and then fixed on the creature, which, in its fury and confusion, lunged at the source of the light and noise. Chaos erupted, screams of terror, the sound of gunshots echoing deafeningly off the cave walls, the creature's shriek, and Boris's continuous roar. Sophia, squeezed into the crevice, felt the ground tremble with the violence of the confrontation. She could hear the sound of flesh being torn, the snap of bones, and the metallic smell of blood mixed with the putrid stench. It was a carnage. Boris, with instinctive intelligence, saw the opportunity. While the creature attacked the men, he turned to Sophia, gently nudging her with his snout towards a side tunnel she hadn't noticed before. It was narrower, darker, and the air there seemed even denser, but it was an exit, a chance to escape the hell unfolding behind them. "Come on, Boris," she whispered, her voice hoarse with terror and exhaustion. With superhuman effort, she dragged herself into the tunnel, her hands and knees scraping against the damp walls. Boris followed her, his massive body barely fitting through the passage. He moved with urgency, but without panic, his amber eyes sweeping the darkness, guiding her. The tunnel was a steep descent, and Sophia felt like she was falling into an abyss. The sound of the combat behind them diminished, muffled by the passage's twists and turns, but the screams and shots still echoed in her mind. They were fleeing from one danger to another, but at least, for now, they were away from Ricardo's men. The descent continued, and the air grew colder, damper. The smell of earth and stone was predominant, but there was a new aroma, a smell of fresh, running water. The tunnel opened into a larger space, and Sophia felt a gentle breeze caress her face. She fumbled in the dark, and her hands touched something smooth and wet. Water. They had reached an underground river. The darkness was total, but the sound of rushing water was unmistakable. Boris stopped, sniffing the air, and then, with a gentle touch, pushed Sophia towards the bank. She felt the icy water envelop her feet, and a chill ran through her body. What to do now? Swim in the dark? To where? The island seemed determined to swallow them. Each refuge turned into a trap. Ricardo, outside, probably already knew of their new escape route. The night was still long, and the island's secrets now took the form of underground currents and the promise of a dive into the unknown. The pursuit continued, and time was running out. Sophia hesitated. The dark, cold water and the sound of the current were intimidating. She could not see an inch ahead, and the fear of what might be beneath the surface was almost as paralyzing as the terror of the creature in the cave. But Boris gave her no choice. With another firm nudge of his snout, he urged her into the water. The tiger, despite his natural aversion to unknown environments, seemed to understand that it was the only way out. He entered first, his massive paws finding purchase on the rocky riverbed. The icy water rose to his chest, but he held firm, his amber eyes glowing in the darkness, fixed on her. With a sigh of resignation and a shiver that was not just from the cold, Sophia plunged in. The water was a shock, cutting off her breath and tightening her chest. She clung to Boris's fur, feeling the strength of his muscles beneath his wet skin. The tiger began to swim, moving with surprising power, his hind paws propelling him against the current. The darkness was absolute, and Sophia closed her eyes, blindly trusting her protector. The sound of the water was deafening, echoing off the invisible tunnel walls, and she felt the current pull them, dragging them into the unknown. They were carried through a labyrinth of underground tunnels, some wide enough for Boris to swim comfortably, others so narrow that he had to squeeze through, scraping against the damp rocks. Sophia felt her body bump against the walls, the icy water invading her mouth and nose with every forced dive. The air became thin in some stretches, and she struggled to breathe, exhaustion taking over every fiber of her being. But Boris did not stop. His survival instinct was unshakable, and he guided her with fierce determination, a beacon of hope in the aquatic darkness. Meanwhile, outside on the luxury yacht, Ricardo received the news with contained fury. A monster, gunshots, and they escaped through an underground river? He growled, his voice low and dangerous. The henchman, pale and trembling, nodded. Yes, sir. The creature. It attacked. We lost 3 men, and the tiger. He took them into a tunnel with water. Ricardo closed his eyes for a moment, his mind working fast. An underground river. All water has an outlet. They can't have gone far. This island is full of rivers and streams that flow into the sea. Find the outlets, block each one of them, and send more men into the island's interior, following the river's course from above. They will emerge somewhere, and when they do, they'll be exhausted, cornered. I don't want a single fish to escape my net. Back in the damp darkness, Sophia felt a change in the current. It grew stronger, faster, and the sound of the water intensified, turning into a roar. They were in a drop. Boris, sensing the danger, grabbed her by the collar of her shirt with his mouth, lifting her slightly out of the water as the current dragged them down. It was a short but violent fall, and Sophia felt her stomach churn. The impact of the water was brutal, but the tiger protected her, cushioning most of the shock with his own body. When the turbulence subsided, they were in a new stretch of the river, wider and with a higher ceiling, allowing Sophia to breathe with less difficulty. The air, however, was heavy, laden with a different smell now. It was not the creature's putrid stench, nor the smell of damp earth, but something more, metallic. And there was a faint glow ahead, a pale light that seemed to come from a crevice in the cave ceiling. Boris swam towards the light, his movements now slower, fatigue beginning to weigh on his muscular body. Sophia, her eyes accustomed to the gloom, began to discern shapes. The light came from an opening high above, revealing a cavernous chamber, with stalactites and stalagmites that looked like sharp teeth of a giant mouth, and the metallic smell intensified. They reached a small gravel beach within the chamber. Boris helped her out of the water, and Sophia fell to her knees, coughing and trembling. The tiger lay beside her, panting but vigilant. The light entering through the crevice in the ceiling was faint, but enough to reveal the scene around them. And what they saw made Sophia's blood run cold. The chamber was not empty. There were skeletons, many of them, not of animals, but of men. Mummified bodies, some still with pieces of ancient clothing scattered on the floor as if they had been dragged there by the current, and the metallic smell. It was of dried blood, of ancient death. But what shocked her most was what was in the center of the chamber, a stone structure covered with strange inscriptions and symbols she had never seen. It looked like an altar, or perhaps an ancient tomb, and upon it something glowed, an object, perhaps a jewel or an artifact. Suddenly a sound, not the sound of water, nor the wind, but a dragging sound, coming from a dark opening at the back of the chamber. It was a familiar sound, a sound that made her hold her breath. The gurgle, the creature. It had followed the river, or perhaps there was more than one. Boris let out a low growl, fatigue forgotten, his eyes fixed on the darkness. They had escaped one trap only to fall into another, even older and more mysterious. The island was not just hiding secrets, it was guarding them, and it seemed that Sophia and Boris had stumbled upon one of them. Time was running out, and with every step, the danger became deeper, more ancestral. The gurgle, that wet, guttural sound, echoed through the cavernous chamber, a harbinger of horror that made the dense air vibrate. Sophia, still on her knees on the gravel beach, felt her blood run cold, exhaustion momentarily forgotten before the imminent danger. Boris, beside her, let out a low, deep growl that reverberated off the damp walls. His amber eyes, previously tired, now gleamed with fierce intensity, fixed on the darkness from which the sound came. The creature, it had followed them, or worse, there was more than one. The pale light seeping through the crevice in the ceiling barely illuminated the back of the chamber, but it was enough to reveal the shapeless silhouette dragging itself out of the dark opening. It was the same creature, or one of its kind, with its damp, scaly skin, its disproportionate limbs, and its reptilian head that looked like an ancient nightmare. Its small, gleaming eyes fixed on them, and the gurgle intensified, transforming into a sharp hiss, a sound of hunger and fury. Sophia instinctively recoiled, her hands scraping on the cold gravel. The sight of the skeletons around them, the mummified remains of men who had met their end there, became even more terrifying. Were they the victims of this creature, or of something even older and crueler that inhabited the island's depths? The metallic smell of dried blood, now mixed with the creature's putrid stench, was almost unbearable. Boris stood up, his muscles tense and ready for combat. He placed himself between Sophia and the creature, a wall of fur and fury. The Siberian tiger, despite the exhaustion of the arduous escape, did not hesitate. His roar, this time, was a warning, a challenge, echoing off the pointed stalactites that hung like teeth from a sleeping monster. The creature, however, was not intimidated. It advanced, its movements clumsy but fast, its claws scraping on the stone floor with a chilling sound. Its focus seemed to be Sophia, perhaps attracted by her warmth or the smell of fear. But Boris intercepted its advance, leaping with surprising agility for an animal of his size. The impact was brutal, a clash of flesh and scales that made the chamber tremble. Sophia, pressed against the damp wall, watched the fight with her heart in her throat. Boris, with his strength and agility, tried to bite and scratch the creature's tough skin, but it was resistant, almost invulnerable. The creature, in turn, tried to wrap the tiger with its long, sticky limbs, seeking to immobilize him. The sound of claws scraping, of flesh being torn, and the creature's furious hiss mingled with Boris's roars. As the battle unfolded, Sophia glanced away for an instant, and her eyes fell again on the stone structure in the center of the chamber. The altar, or tomb, with its indecipherable inscriptions, and the object that glowed upon it. It was a stone or a crystal that pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible, but constant light. A light that seemed to have a life of its own, an emerald glow that contrasted with the darkness and chaos around them. Could that be the key? An ancient artifact, perhaps the reason the creature guarded this place? Or an even greater trap? The creature managed to sink one of its claws into Boris's shoulder, and the tiger let out a yelp of pain, recoiling for an instant. Dark blood trickled down his wet fur, but the wound only ignited an even greater fury in his eyes. He counterattacked with renewed ferocity, his fangs seeking the creature's throat, a vulnerable point he seemed to have perceived. Sophia knew they could not stay there. Boris was wounded and the fight was uneven. They needed a way out, and fast. Her eyes swept the chamber, searching for any crevice, any tunnel that might offer an escape route. The emerald light of the artifact seemed to draw her, almost as if calling to her. Suddenly, a different sound, not the creature's hiss nor Boris's roar, but a distant, muffled noise coming from above. It was the sound of engines, of propellers. Ricardo. He was approaching, and his men, no doubt, were already searching the exits of the underground river. They were trapped between the creature and her grandson's henchmen. With a final effort, Boris managed to push the creature back, gaining a few precious seconds. He turned to Sophia, his amber eyes pleading for action. She understood. There was no time to hesitate. "The altar, Boris!" she shouted, her voice hoarse. "That object!" The tiger, with an almost human intelligence, seemed to understand. He let out a final roar at the creature, a warning to keep it away, and then turned, limping slightly towards the center of the chamber. Sophia followed him, her legs trembling, but propelled by a desperate adrenaline. The creature, furious at the distraction, let out a deafening hiss and lunged again with renewed speed, determined to prevent their escape. Boris, with one last roar of defiance, pushed Sophia into the newly revealed passage. "Go, Boris!" she pleaded, but the tiger hesitated, his eyes fixed on the approaching creature. He needed to buy time. The sound of engines outside grew sharper, and the echo of male voices began to penetrate the chamber, coming from an opening above. Ricardo was here. The island, with its ancient secrets and modern dangers, was closing in on them. Sophia knew she could not leave Boris behind. They had reached a point of no return, where the only chance of survival was to trust each other and the mysteries the island still held. Sophia, her heart pounding, saw the glint of sacrifice in Boris's amber eyes. He would not leave her, not after everything. With a roar that seemed to tear the very stone of the cave, the tiger launched himself one last time against the creature, not to fight, but to create a brutal distraction. His claws ripped into the monster's scaly skin, eliciting a shriek of pain and fury that made the ground tremble. The creature, momentarily stunned and enraged, recoiled, focusing its attention on the tiger that defied it. It was the instant Sophia needed. Her trembling fingers reached for the emerald artifact on the altar. The moment her skin touched the cold, vibrating surface of the stone, a wave of energy coursed through her arm, icy and electrifying. The emerald pulsed with a more intense light, almost like a beating heart, and she tore it from the altar, feeling the object's weight and strange vitality in her hand. In the same second, Boris, with an agile leap despite his injury, turned and pushed her into the newly revealed passage. "Come on, Boris!" she cried, her voice choked with fear and urgency. The tiger no longer hesitated. With one last look at the creature, writhing in pain and anger, he squeezed through the narrow opening, following Sophia into the darkness. The passage was tight, damp, and smelled of ancient earth and mold. The emerald light in Sophia's hand was the only source of illumination, casting dancing shadows on the rocky walls, revealing inscriptions even older and more indecipherable than those on the altar. They were symbols that seemed to tell a story of forgotten ages, of something that inhabited the island long before men. Behind them, the creature's furious hiss echoed, mingled with the sound of its claws, scraping on the stone as it tried to squeeze through the opening. The passage was too narrow for it, but the monster was persistent, its fury fueled by the escape of its prey. The sound of crumbling stone and the creature's heavy breathing became a terrifying accompaniment to their escape. And then, the other sounds. Louder now, unmistakable. The distant hum of helicopter engines grew into a rising roar, and the echo of male voices, amplified by the main cave's acoustics, began to penetrate the passage. Ricardo. He and his men had arrived. They were trapped between the creature trying to squeeze through the passage and her grandson's henchmen who were now invading the main chamber. Boris grunted, a sound of frustration and pain. His injured shoulder throbbed, but he held firm, protecting Sophia as they advanced through the passage. The emerald in her hand not only illuminated, but seemed to guide, its greenish light pulsing stronger in certain directions. The passage began to descend on a gentle slope, and the air grew denser, colder. The humidity increased, and the sound of running water became audible ahead. Not the river that had brought them, but another, perhaps a subterranean tributary, or an even deeper source. The passage walls became smoother, as if they had been polished by the passage of something, or by the action of water over millennia. Suddenly, the passage opened into a smaller but even stranger chamber. It was round, with a pool of crystal-clear water in the center, from which the sound of running water came. The ceiling was low, and the emerald light revealed more inscriptions on the walls. But these were different. They were drawings of winged creatures, of humanoid beings with scales, and of a large five-pointed star that seemed to radiate power. And in the center of the pool, something glowed. Not the emerald, but something else, submerged. The sound of the creature trying to force its way into the passage behind them intensified. And now, the shouts of Ricardo's men could be heard clearly in the main chamber. They were there. They had found the entrance. "We don't have time, Boris," Sophia whispered, her voice hoarse. The tiger looked at the pool, then at the passage, his amber eyes assessing the options. The creature was almost managing to force its way in, and Ricardo's men were a few meters away. The round chamber seemed like a dead end, but the water, the pool, offered a possibility. With a decisive growl, Boris pushed Sophia towards the pool. The emerald in her hand pulsed with a frantic light, almost as if reacting to the water or the submerged object. Sophia, without hesitation, plunged into the cold, dark water, pulling Boris with her. The water was deeper than it looked, and the object at the bottom glowed with its own bluish light, which mingled with the green of the emerald. The moment their heads disappeared beneath the surface, the sound of shattering stone echoed through the chamber. The creature had finally breached the passage and dragged itself inside, its reptilian eyes fixed on the pool. And right behind it, the shadows of Ricardo's men began to appear in the opening, their flashlights sweeping the chamber, revealing the creature and the empty pool. Sophia and Boris were now in a new realm of darkness, submerged. The emerald light and the bluish glow of the object at the bottom of the pool being their only guides. The air in Sophia's lungs began to burn, but she clung to Boris. Feeling the tiger's strength even underwater, they were fleeing from two predators, one ancient and one modern, into the unknown depths of the island, where the oldest and most dangerous secret still awaited. The island was not just guarding its mysteries, it was swallowing them. The cold water swallowed Sophia, an icy shock that stole her already scarce breath. The world above, with its shouts and hisses transformed into a muffled, disturbing silence. The emerald light in her hand pulsed with an almost feverish intensity, mingling with the bluish glow emanating from the bottom of the pool. It was as if two hearts, one green and one blue, beat in unison in the dark depths. Boris, despite his injured shoulder, moved with surprising grace. His paws propelling him through the dense water, he was beside her, a silent guardian, his amber eyes now reflecting the mystical light that enveloped them. Sophia's lungs burned, every second submerged a torture, but determination was stronger than panic. She needed to reach that blue object. The island was not just swallowing them, it was pulling them into its own pulsating heart. With one last effort, she extended her free hand, her fingers brushing the smooth, cold surface of the blue stone. The instant of contact, an electric current, not painful but vibrant, coursed through her body. The blue light intensified, pulsing in sync with the emerald, and then, with a sound that only she seemed to hear, a deep hum that resonated in her bones, the bottom of the pool opened. It was not a crevice, but a perfectly sculpted circular opening, from which a gentle but irresistible current began to pull them down. Boris, sensing the change, gently pushed her into the passage, following her without hesitation. They were sucked into an underwater tunnel, the darkness almost total, were it not for the dance of green and blue lights. The tunnel was narrow, the walls smooth and cold, and the current dragged them with increasing speed. Sophia felt the air running out, the pressure increasing in her ears, but the sight of Boris ahead of her, swimming with unshakable strength, prevented her from succumbing to despair. Above them, the sound of agitated water and the creature's furious hiss were muffled, but still audible, a constant reminder that the pursuit had not ended. The creature, with its shapeless mass, could not squeeze through the passage. Its cries of rage echoed in the chamber above, mingled with the roars of Ricardo's men, who now fired blindly into the water, their bullets ricocheting harmlessly. They were lost temporarily, but the island was only just beginning to reveal its depths. The current carried them for what seemed an eternity, until, suddenly, the tunnel opened into a vast underwater cavern. The combined light of the artifacts barely penetrated the dark immensity, revealing colossal rock formations that rose like pillars of a submerged temple. The air, to Sophia's relief, was present here, in a gigantic air bubble that formed on the cavern's ceiling, like an inverted dome. With one last push, Boris helped her emerge to the water's surface, inside the air bubble. The air was humid and heavy, with a strange smell of minerals and something ancient, but it was air. Sophia coughed, gasping, her muscles aching and her heart pounding wildly. Boris, beside her, shook his head, scattering drops of water, and let out a low grunt, a sound of relief and exhaustion. They were in a new sanctuary, a place that seemed untouched by time. The emerald light in her hand and the bluish glow of the object that now floated gently beside her in the water, a smooth, perfect orb, illuminated the chamber. The walls were adorned with hieroglyphs even more complex and intricate than those seen previously, telling a story that Sophia could barely begin to decipher. There were drawings of stars, of constellations, and of beings that seemed to be the guardians of this place, with eyes that shone like the stones she held. In the center of the air bubble, a rocky platform rose from the water, and upon it a pedestal. There was nothing on the pedestal, but it radiated a silent energy, as if waiting for something. Sophia felt a pull, an irresistible attraction to that place. The emerald in her hand pulsed more strongly, and the blue orb floated towards her, as if wanting to unite with it. The island was revealing its deepest secrets, but with each revelation, the feeling of being manipulated, guided by a greater force, grew stronger. They had escaped Ricardo and the creature, but they had plunged into an even greater mystery, one that seemed to have been planned for them, for Sophia and Boris, since the beginning of time. What did the island want from them? And what awaited on the empty pedestal? Fate, or something older, seemed to await their next move. The air in the bubble was dense, laden with a silence that seemed to vibrate with the island's very age. Sophia, still gasping, felt every beat of her heart echo in the immensity of the cavern. The shock of the cold water and the desperate escape had taken their toll, but an indomitable force, born of adversity and the proximity of truth, propelled her. The emerald in her hand pulsed with a feverish intensity, and the blue orb, now floating gently beside her in the water, mirrored this rhythm. Like two ancient hearts beating in unison, they were not just stones, they were keys to a mystery the island had guarded for millennia. With renewed effort, Sophia propelled herself onto the rocky platform that rose from the water. Boris, her loyal guardian, emerged beside her, shaking his head and scattering shimmering droplets. His amber eyes, fixed on the empty pedestal, seemed to comprehend the gravity of the moment. He was more than an animal. He was a link, a bridge between the known world and the unknown that now enveloped them. The pedestal, smooth and ancient, radiated a silent energy, a promise. Sophia raised the emerald, its green light intensifying, almost blinding. The blue orb, as if drawn by an invisible force, floated from the water and hovered before her, its lights intertwining in a mystical dance. It was a moment of pure intuition, of a connection that transcended reason. Guided by a primal instinct, she placed the emerald on the pedestal. In the next instant, the blue orb gently descended to rest beside it. A low, deep hum, which resonated in her bones, filled the cavern. It was not an audible sound, but a vibration that seemed to awaken the very rock. The entire cavern seemed to react. The hieroglyphs on the walls, previously just drawings, now glowed with their own light, moving, telling a story in shimmering images. Figures of winged creatures and humanoid beings with scales danced on the walls, no longer static but fluid, narrating a cosmic epic. They showed a journey from distant stars, the arrival to this world, and the planting of a seed of power on this island. The large, five-pointed star, which Sophia had seen in previous inscriptions, now radiated from the apex of the air dome, a beacon of pure energy. The hum intensified, building to a crescendo that resonated in Sophia's soul. The two artifacts on the pedestal began to spin, faster and faster, merging into a single pillar of dazzling light that shot upwards, piercing the ceiling of the air bubble and the very surface of the water. Up above, in the world of their pursuers, chaos erupted. The pillar of light, now visible through the water, emerged from the pool, a beacon of pure and indomitable energy. Ricardo and his men, still firing blindly into the water, were caught by surprise. The creature, which had finally managed to squeeze through the narrow passage, let out a sharp hiss, not of fury, but of something that seemed like pain, or perhaps recognition. The wave of energy from the pillar of light swept through the chamber. The creature, instead of attacking, recoiled, its scales shimmering as if absorbing the energy. Its reptilian eyes, previously filled with predatory rage, now displayed a strange and ancient wisdom. It let out a guttural sound, not a roar, but a lament, and then, with surprising speed, turned and crawled back into the passages, disappearing into the darkness. It was not a monster, but a guardian, disturbed, now perhaps appeased. Ricardo and his men were not so lucky. The raw energy, too much for their mortal senses, disoriented them. Their weapons fell to the ground as they clutched their heads, screaming. The helicopter, hovering precariously over the island, sputtered, its engines failing, caught in the electromagnetic pulse of the island's awakening. It began to descend, spinning out of control towards the dense jungle below. The island was purifying itself, rejecting the intrusion. Below, in the cavern, Sophia remained in a trance. The pillar of light stabilized, revealing not a destructive force, but a portal. Images flickered within it, distant galaxies, nebulae, and then, closer, a vision of the island as it once was. vibrant with life, cared for by beings of light. She understood now. This was not just a hiding place, but a sanctuary, a beacon, a repository of ancient knowledge and power, waiting for the right moment, the right touch to awaken. The light began to diminish, but not to disappear. It coalesced around the pedestal, forming an ethereal, shimmering sphere. Within it, the emerald and the blue orb pulsed in perfect harmony. Sophia felt a deep sense of peace, a connection to something vast and eternal. She had not found a treasure of gold or jewels, but something far more precious, a truth, a purpose. Boris nudged her gently, his large head resting against her side. He looked at her, his amber eyes soft, understanding. He had guided her here, protected her, not only from Ricardo, but from the very forces of nature and time. He was more than a tiger. He was a companion, a kindred spirit on this cosmic journey. The air in the cavern began to change, to clear. The strange mineral smell was replaced by a fresh, clean aroma, like rain after a long drought. The water in the pool below them, previously dark and mysterious, now shone with a soft, inviting light. The island had accepted them. Sophia looked at the pedestal, then at Boris, and then at the shimmering entrance of the tunnel from which they had come. The way back was open, but the world to which they would return was forever changed. She was no longer the old woman thrown to the sharks. She was a guardian of secrets, a witness to wonders. The island, having revealed its heart, now offered a choice: to stay, to learn, to become part of its ancient rhythm, or to return, carrying its wisdom to a world that desperately needed it. The decision was hers, but she knew deep in her heart that wherever she went, Boris would be by her side. The journey had ended, but a new one, perhaps even deeper, had just begun. The island had not just swallowed them, it had transformed them, spitting them back into the world, reborn,